Did you know that the story of an ordinary woman who lived in ancient times holds powerful lessons that can change your life today? Have you ever stopped to think about how faithfulness, the choices we make, and even difficult situations can lead us to an unexpected blessing? Well, all of this is found in the life of Ruth, a woman who, despite facing great challenges, remained firm in her faith and made decisions that changed her destiny forever. Want to know how? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may transform the way you see life. Let's discover together the 5 powerful lessons from Ruth's life. Welcome to the Curious Bible channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a biblical curiosity. Ruth wasn't born in Israel. She was a Moabite. Her people, the Moabites, had a culture and religion quite different from the Israelites. They did not share the same beliefs or traditions. She grew up in a distant land where the rules and customs were distinct from those of her mother-in-law, Naomi, who was Israeli. Now imagine how someone like Ruth could feel out of place when, through the death of her husband, she was forced to completely change her life. Ruth's fate began to change dramatically with the death of her husband. She became a widow while still young, in a foreign land with an uncertain future. The pain of this loss came not just from the emotional emptiness, but from the loneliness of being in a land where no one knew her, with no family or support system. Naomi's situation wasn't much different. She too had lost her husband and children. Their pain was shared, and the two women in the midst of this tragedy were about to make a decision that would change their lives. Naomi, now a widow without children, decided to return to her hometown, Bethlehem, in Israel. She knew that the possibility of a better life lay there, where she could still be supported by her family and friends. Upon hearing that Naomi was returning to Bethlehem, Ruth knew this was an opportunity to make a crucial decision. She could choose to return to her homeland, Moab, where she might be able to rebuild her life, or she could choose to follow her mother-in-law to a strange land with no guarantees of a prosperous future. But more than anything, she would have to face the issue of being alone, without a family to support her, and not even knowing what she would find in Israel. Ruth made a bold decision. She didn't choose the easy or safe path. She decided to follow Naomi, even though she knew life in Israel would be full of challenges. She did this not just out of love for her mother-in-law, but also by faith. Naomi tried to convince her to stay in Moab, suggesting that Ruth return to her parents' home and start over, perhaps even marrying another Moabite. But despite all the encouragements to follow her own path, Ruth remained firm. She said something simple, yet profoundly significant. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." These words, though simple, expressed a radical shift in her life. Ruth was not just deciding to follow her mother-in-law, she was, in fact, choosing to follow the God of Israel. By making this statement, she was doing more than promising loyalty to her mother-in-law. She was committing to change her life, leaving everything she knew behind and trusting that God would guide her. It's interesting to think about what this decision meant for Ruth. She was abandoning a culture, a religion, and a life she knew well to embrace something completely new. She knew this wouldn't be easy. She knew she would be a foreigner in a strange land, but her choice was grounded in something bigger than herself: faith in God. Ruth teaches us a powerful lesson in this moment. True faithfulness doesn't seek guarantees, but offers complete surrender, even in the face of the unknown. Sometimes in life, we are called to make decisions that seem risky without knowing what the future holds. It could be a career change, moving to a new city, or even choosing a harder path, but with the faith that God will sustain us. Ruth's story reveals that when we act with faith and faithfulness, the doors that open are often bigger than we could have imagined. With her decision made, Ruth and Naomi began their journey to Bethlehem. The road wouldn't be easy. They had no riches or many possessions, and as widows, they were socially vulnerable. But their journey would be a journey of faith. Even without knowing what awaited them, they trusted that God would guide them. And in the end, Ruth's choice to follow Naomi and adopt the faith of Israel would lead her to a path of blessings she could never have imagined. Naomi, for her part, was aware of the magnitude of what was happening. Although she tried to discourage Ruth from following her, she couldn't help but feel the depth of her daughter-in-law's loyalty. This decision, so courageous and full of faith, would culminate in something great. Ruth didn't know it, but she was about to become a key player in God's plan for the restoration of Israel. Now think, how many times in our lives do we make choices based on faith, even without having all the answers? Ruth's story teaches us that faithfulness is more powerful than circumstances, and that even in the most difficult situations, God has a plan to lead us to something greater. After this decision of faith and courage, Ruth and Naomi were about to face more challenges, but also a new chance for a fresh start. How would Ruth, a foreigner, deal with the difficulties of starting from scratch in Bethlehem? And what would she do when, for the first time, she would work in an unfamiliar field, seeking sustenance for herself and her mother-in-law? Let's discover how Ruth's hard work and humility opened unexpected doors. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you had to leave everything behind for something unknown? Ruth did that. In a moment of pain and uncertainty, she chose a difficult path driven by faith. But what she didn't know was that this decision would lead her to a surprising and blessing-filled destiny. Want to know how her courage became a turning point in the history of Israel? Stay tuned. You won't believe what happens next. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city of Bethlehem when Ruth and Naomi arrived. The streets were still quiet, with few people walking about. But the anxiety and nervousness were palpable for Ruth. She felt like a complete stranger in a place where no one knew her, where no one knew her story. What awaited her there? How would she survive? She had no wealth, no land, and as a widow, she was seen by many as someone with no social value. Ruth knew she would need to work hard to survive. There was no time to waste, and to feed herself and her mother-in-law, she would need to find a way to earn her keep. The tradition of the time allowed widows and orphans to follow the reapers in the fields during harvest, picking up the ears of grain that fell to the ground. It was simple work, but necessary for those without other means of support. That day, Ruth gathered her courage and told Naomi that she would go to the fields to find a landowner kind enough to let her pick up the fallen grain. Naomi, always concerned, had no choice but to support her. So Ruth made her way to the field, not knowing exactly what she would find, but hoping that the Lord would guide her. She was willing to do anything to care for her mother-in-law, and this was her only option. When she arrived at the field, there was little certainty about what would happen. She entered, and like a silent miracle, the workers were harvesting, and Ruth began to follow the reapers. She gathered all she could, not caring about the hard work. After all, she had no other choice. This was her way to ensure food for herself and Naomi. As she worked, something caught Ruth's attention. A man was watching the workers from a distance with a firm posture and authority. It was Boaz, the owner of the field. Boaz was a wealthy, respected man, but also known for his kindness and generosity. He owned vast properties and had a good reputation in Bethlehem. When Boaz noticed Ruth's presence in the field, he approached and asked his servants who the woman collecting the fallen grain was. The servants, watching Ruth, explained that she was the young Moabite woman who had come with Naomi. They spoke of her loyalty to her mother-in-law and how she had been working since morning without rest. Impressed by Ruth's story, Boaz didn't waste any time approaching her. He was direct, with kind words and a look of compassion. "Ruth, listen to what I'm going to say," he said, calling her by name. "Stay in my fields. Don't go to other fields. Stay close to my servants and work only here." Ruth, surprised by Boaz's kindness, could hardly believe the generosity of this man. She was merely doing what she knew was necessary to survive, but he seemed willing to help her in an unexpected way. Boaz instructed her to drink from the water provided by his servants and assured her that she would be protected. He even commanded his workers to drop some extra grain on purpose when they saw her, so she would have more to gather. Boaz's behavior was unusual. He didn't have to do this, but his act of generosity, guided by genuine compassion, was what made him different from many other men of the time. He didn't see Ruth as just a stranger, but as someone who, just like him, was trying to survive in a difficult world. He recognized in her a loyalty and strength of character that deserved to be rewarded. Touched by Boaz's kindness, Ruth bowed before him, thanking him. She didn't understand why he was being so generous, especially someone like Boaz, who had so much to lose by helping a foreign woman. But Boaz, in his words, made it clear that he was acting not out of self-interest, but out of gratitude to God, who had blessed him with much. He knew that, in a time of scarcity and hardship, reaching out to those in need was something that would please God. The scene in the field was a fascinating contrast. On one side, Ruth, a woman with no status, a foreigner and a widow, was there, doing hard labor to care for her mother-in-law. On the other, Boaz, a wealthy, powerful and respected man, was there offering unconditional support, even without knowing her personal story. What united these two characters was something much deeper than a simple exchange of favors. It was faith in God, a willingness to do good, and gratitude for all that he had given. And it was in this moment that Ruth discovered that faithfulness to God, expressed through small acts of kindness, never goes unnoticed. She wasn't just picking up grain, but planting seeds for a future she hadn't imagined. Boaz, in turn, didn't yet know that his kindness would be the key to a much larger future, a story that would span generations and change the history of Israel. Ruth's encounter with Boaz was more than a coincidence. It was part of God's divine plan to restore the life of a woman who had lost everything. But in that field, under the hot sun and amidst the hard work, something greater was being cultivated. After this act of generosity, Ruth and Boaz's fates were intertwined in a way neither could have anticipated. What would happen when Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, found out that Ruth was working in Boaz's field? Would she recognize the opportunity that lay before them? Let's find out what comes next, where important decisions will be made, and Ruth's story might take a surprising turn. Did you know that sometimes the simplest gestures can change our entire story? In the field of Boaz, an act of generosity revealed an unexpected destiny. What's next for Ruth and Naomi? Stay with me, you won't believe what happens next. After the harvest, Ruth returned to Naomi's house, exhausted but with a heart full of gratitude. She had something new to share with her mother-in-law. When she entered the house, Naomi looked at her with a different sparkle in her eyes. Ruth was carrying more than just barley stalks. She brought with her a sign of something greater, something that might not be immediately clear to either of them. Seeing the barley and hearing the story of how Boaz had treated her with such kindness, Naomi was moved. "My daughter," Naomi said with a look of wisdom and discernment, "this man, Boaz, is not only generous, he is a relative of ours. He has an important role to play in our story." Naomi, with the experience of a life full of ups and downs, recognized in Boaz's actions something that, up until that moment, Ruth had not fully understood. Boaz wasn't just helping Ruth out of kindness. He was, in fact, a goal. The kinsman redeemer, a family member responsible for redeeming a widow and restoring the inheritance of the deceased family member. Naomi knew that this act of generosity was not just a random gesture. It was, in fact, an invitation for something greater to happen. She saw the opportunity to transform their situation and, more importantly, to restore the family of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. The concept of the Goel was deep within Israeli culture. The Goel not only had the right to buy land lost by the family, but he could also marry the widow of a deceased relative to ensure the continuation of the family name. Ruth wasn't sure how to act. She was a little confused about the right way to proceed, but Naomi, with wisdom, knew it was time to act. She suggested a bold plan, one that, if followed to the letter, could change both of their lives forever. "Ruth," Naomi said with calm determination, "it's time for you to go back to Boaz's field, but this time at night. When he finishes eating and drinking and lies down, go to him, find out where he is lying, and place yourself at his feet. He will know what to do." Ruth, surprised by the idea, hesitated for a moment, but the desire to act in faith and trust in her mother-in-law's guidance led her to accept the plan. Naomi knew it was a risk, but she also knew it was the only chance to restore Ruth's life and bring a meaningful change to both of them. This plan, although unconventional, was an act of courage, not only from Ruth but also from Naomi. The older woman was taking a step of faith, believing that the Lord would guide this gesture to something good, something that would restore their future. That night, when the moon illuminated the field and the night winds blew gently, Ruth prepared to follow her mother-in-law's instructions. She knew she was doing something bold, something that could change her life forever, but she also knew that trusting in this moment of uncertainty was a step of faith. She had to trust not only in Naomi's wisdom, but in God, who was undoubtedly guiding her actions. Ruth went to the field with her heart pounding. When she arrived, she saw Boaz lying on a pile of grain, as was customary after a night of harvest. Quietly, she approached and, with a nervous heart, did what Naomi had told her. She positioned herself at Boaz's feet, waiting for him to notice her presence. What would happen now? Would Boaz understand what Ruth was trying to do? Meanwhile, Boaz, still asleep, was unaware of the surprise waiting for him. But Ruth and Boaz's story was about to take a new turn, and what happened in those hours of darkness could change everything forever. With Naomi's bold plan set in motion, Ruth finds herself in a position of faith, courage, and anticipation. But would Boaz understand Ruth's intentions? What would he do in the face of such a daring move? This video will reveal what happens when Ruth and Boaz meet at midnight, and the words exchanged between them could determine the fate of the two. Women, don't miss the next installment, as something extraordinary is about to unfold. Have you ever imagined doing something so bold and courageous that it could change your life forever? That's exactly what Ruth did, following a risky plan from her mother-in-law. But will this act of faith really bring the change they desperately need? What will happen when Ruth meets Boaz at midnight? Stay tuned, because their destiny is about to take an unexpected turn. The night was quiet and still, with only the soft rustle of the breeze passing through the barley fields. Ruth lay at Boaz's feet, waiting for him to wake up. Every second felt like an eternity. Nervousness was written all over her face, but her determination to follow Naomi's advice was even greater. She knew this wasn't just an act of courage, but a move of faith. When the man beside her woke up, everything would change. Suddenly, Boaz stirred, made a slight throat noise, and turned, noticing a presence beside him. He quickly sat up, surprised, but as he saw the young woman at his feet, his expression shifted from shock to a thoughtful gaze. By this time, Ruth remained silent, simply waiting for Boaz's reaction, not knowing what to expect. What would he do now? Would he understand Ruth's gesture as a request for redemption and restoration, or would he see her as merely an intruder? Boaz, still unsure of the situation, looked into Ruth's eyes and with a firm and calm voice asked, "Who are you?" Ruth, without hesitation, replied, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread the corner of your cloak over me, for you are my kinsman redeemer." These simple and direct words were filled with profound meaning. The cloak was a symbol of protection and commitment. By asking Boaz to spread his cloak over her, Ruth was implicitly asking for redemption, requesting that Boaz take her as his wife to restore the lineage of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. The silence that followed was heavy. Boaz, touched by Ruth's courage and faith, stood still for a moment, reflecting on what he had just heard. It was an unusual situation, and he couldn't make a hasty decision. Boaz knew that Ruth's act was a sign of trust in both God and him, and it moved him deeply. But there was a matter he couldn't ignore. There was another relative, a closer kinsman who, according to the law, had the right to redeem the land and marry Ruth before him. Boaz, with a gentle look, gazed at Ruth and said, "Do not fear, my daughter. I will do all that you have asked, for I know you are a woman of character and faith. However, there is a closer relative who has the right to act before me. But if he is unable to fulfill his role, then I will take his place, as the Lord permits." Ruth, feeling relieved, responded humbly, "I trust you, Boaz. I know you will do what is right." He then asked her to stay there until dawn, so no one would know of her presence until the matter was resolved clearly. That night, Boaz not only recognized Ruth's courage, but also her obedience to God and her faith in his providence. He knew that regardless of the outcome, this act would not be in vain. Ruth, for her part, knew that the Lord was guiding every step of their journey and that her life and Naomi's were in his hands. At dawn, Boaz gave Ruth an extra portion of barley to take back to her mother-in-law. "Do not go back empty-handed. Let this act of generosity remind you that you are worthy of honor," he said, handing Ruth the large portion of barley. Ruth thanked him, and with a light heart, she made her way home. When Ruth arrived at Naomi's house, she was radiant. Naomi, with a curious look, quickly asked, "What happened? What did Boaz say?" Ruth, with a confident smile, told Naomi everything, from the request to Boaz's response. Naomi, with the wisdom life had given her, listened attentively, and then said, "Now, my daughter, we must wait. He will make the right decision, and the Lord will be with us." But the wait would not be long. The next step was about to be taken, and as always, Ruth and Naomi's faith would be tested. As Boaz began to walk the path of redemption for Ruth, their story was drawing closer to a climax that would bring not only the restoration of Ruth's life, but also an unparalleled blessing. Boaz's response brought relief and hope to Ruth and Naomi, but there was still an obstacle to overcome. The closer relative, who had the right to redeem Elimelech's inheritance, needed to be consulted. What will happen now? Will he take Boaz's place, or will Boaz finally become Ruth's redeemer? Get ready for what's coming, where the solution will be revealed and Ruth's destiny will be decided. Imagine taking such a bold step that could change your life forever. That's exactly what Ruth did that quiet night. But when Boaz wakes up, will he respond the way she expected? Stay tuned to discover the decision that could transform their future and that of an entire family. The dawn brought with it a new hope. Boaz, determined to fulfill his promise to Ruth, knew the time to make a decision had arrived. The law of Israel was clear. If there was a closer relative, he was to be the first to exercise the right of redemption and marry the widow to preserve the family line. But Boaz, with his upright character, would not hesitate to ensure that justice was done. Early in the morning, Boaz went to the city. He was resolved to settle the matter, leaving no room for doubt about Ruth and Naomi's future. He knew that, regardless of the outcome, Ruth's honor had to be respected, and the blessing she had received could not be lost. Walking through the streets of Bethlehem, Boaz made his way to the city gate, where the elders gathered to deliberate on legal matters. There, Boaz found the closest relative, the man who had the right to redeem Elimelech's property. Boaz, with a serious expression, invited him to sit with the elders to discuss an important matter. The man, unaware of what was to come, sat down and listened attentively. Boaz then began to lay out the situation. "You know that our relative Naomi, who returned from Moab, has Elimelech's land, and it is for sale. As the closest relative, you have the right to redeem this property. If you wish, you may buy it." The man, intrigued by the proposal, replied promptly, "Yes, I will redeem the land. I will do it." But Boaz did not stop there. He knew there was more to be said. With a penetrating gaze, Boaz continued, "There is something else. When you buy the land, you must also marry Elimelech's widow, Ruth, so that Elimelech's name will be preserved in his inheritance." The man, beginning to realize the gravity of the decision, responded with hesitation, "Then I cannot redeem the land, because if I marry Ruth, my inheritance will be jeopardized." Boaz knew this was the pivotal moment. The closest relative, realizing the implications of the decision, chose not to exercise his right to redeem the property or marry Ruth. The responsibility then passed to Boaz, who did not hesitate to make the proposal. "I will take the place then. I will marry Ruth and preserve Elimelech's name," Boaz said with calm resolve. The man, in the presence of the elders and witnesses, withdrew from his obligation, allowing Boaz to fulfill his role as the redeemer. The elders, witnessing the resolution of the situation, not only approved Boaz's decision, but also blessed the couple. They said, "May the Lord make the woman you marry like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel. May you prosper in Ephrathah and have a famous name in Bethlehem." With the agreement finalized, Boaz immediately took Ruth as his wife. The decision was made, and the story of Ruth and Naomi's redemption was about to reach its climax. Boaz's and Ruth's faithfulness, along with their obedience to God, ensured the fulfillment of the law and brought an unparalleled blessing. By marrying Boaz, Ruth found not only a husband, but a redeemer. From that moment, she would no longer be seen as a foreigner and widow with no future. She now had a place and a promise of abundant life alongside Boaz. The marriage between Boaz and Ruth was more than just a personal union. It was the fulfillment of God's plan to restore Elimelech's line and preserve Israel's inheritance. Ruth became part of a story greater than she could have ever imagined, a story that connected directly to the lineage of King David and later to the lineage of Jesus Christ. Naomi, who had lost everything, now saw her life being restored in a surprising way. Her daughter-in-law, Ruth, had not only been faithful to her, but was now an essential part of the restoration of her family. With the decision made and Boaz and Ruth's marriage sealed, a new chapter opened for all. The promise of blessings was about to be realized. But how would this impact their lives? What fruits would this union bear? What if one man's decision could change an entire family's history? Boaz is about to make a choice that goes beyond inheritance and marriage. But what happens when he risks everything for Ruth? And what does his action teach us about redemption and faith? Don't go anywhere. Boaz's answer may be more surprising than you imagine. The marriage of Boaz and Ruth was more than just a ceremony. It marked the beginning of a new era for everyone involved. God's blessing rested upon this union, and the fruits of their faithfulness were about to be revealed in a glorious way. It didn't take long for Ruth, now Boaz's wife, to become pregnant. The promise of restoration, which had once seemed distant, was now coming to life before everyone's eyes. Ruth's womb became the stage for a silent miracle. Boaz, who had already shown unwavering faith in God, and Ruth, with her loyalty, were now preparing to give birth to what would become a powerful symbol of redemption, not only for their own story, but for a lineage that would mark the history of Israel forever. The baby, born in Bethlehem, was named Obed, which means servant or worshipper, a name that reflected the new phase of life for them all. As Naomi held her grandson in her arms, she could not contain the tears of gratitude and emotion. She had endured deep losses, but now she was witnessing the fulfillment of a divine promise. The Lord has not left me without a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer for my family. The pain and mourning that had marked her recent years were now giving way to joy and celebration. Obed was not just a blessing for Ruth and Boaz, but for the nation of Israel. His arrival brought hope for a better future. Naomi, who had lost everything, now saw her lineage being restored in a way she never imagined. What had seemed impossible was happening, and the legacy of her family was guaranteed. But the story of Obed didn't end there. He grew up, and over time became the father of Jesse, the father of David, the future king of Israel. Thus, the lineage of Ruth and Boaz, which began with an act of loyalty and unconditional love, became directly connected to the story of David, and later to the lineage of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The divine plan, which had seemed so distant and uncertain in the earlier chapters of Ruth's story, was now unfolding in a glorious way. Obed, who began his life as a simple son of Ruth and Boaz, became a crucial link in the history of Israel, and his descendants would bring salvation to the entire world. Ruth's role, a Moabite woman, a foreigner, and a widow, was never underestimated in the eyes of God. Her faith, her faithfulness, and her willingness to follow the divine calling, even in the face of difficult circumstances, made her an essential part of God's redemptive plan for all of humanity. The birth of Obed, the first great blessing Ruth received alongside Boaz, was just the beginning of something grand. When Ruth held her son in her arms, she could not have imagined the eternal impact that moment would have on the history of the world. The boy, Obed, was the first step toward the coming of David, and through him the lineage that would bring Jesus. The story of Ruth and Boaz, which began with a simple act of faithfulness, culminated in an incomparable blessing, not only for their family, but for all the people of Israel. But what more can we learn from this incredible story of redemption? What legacy does it leave? The story of Ruth and Boaz, which began with a simple act of faithfulness, culminated in an incomparable blessing, not only for their family, but for all the people of Israel. But what more can we learn from this incredible story of redemption? What legacy does it leave us? Stay with us as we explore the eternal impact of the lessons we can draw from Ruth's life. With the arrival of Obed, the story of Ruth and Boaz seems to reach its peak, but the impact of their journey extends far beyond their own lives and that generation. What began as a simple story of loyalty and courage became an eternal lesson, echoing to this day. The lessons drawn from Ruth's life are powerful and continue to transform the lives of thousands around the world. The first lesson we can learn from Ruth's life is about unwavering loyalty. From the moment she chose to follow Naomi, her mother-in-law, instead of returning to her family and homeland, Ruth demonstrated a loyalty that transcended all cultural and personal barriers. She had no obligation to follow Naomi, but she chose to remain loyal to her, even knowing it meant leaving behind everything she knew. Her decision wasn't just an act of respect, but a genuine and committed act of love, shaping the course of her life forever. In our own lives, loyalty to God, to family, and to our responsibilities is crucial for us to see God's hand moving powerfully in our lives. Ruth teaches us that when we are loyal, even in the most difficult circumstances, God will honor our faithfulness and reward us in ways beyond our understanding. The second lesson Ruth's life teaches us is about humility and hard work. When She arrived in Bethlehem with Naomi. She had no problem starting from the bottom, working in the fields and gleaning barley stalks. Although she was a young and in some ways attractive woman, Ruth did not seek shortcuts or rely on her appearance to achieve a better life. She was humble and hardworking, accepting the tough work that came with her new beginning. She wasn't ashamed of being seen doing the most humble tasks, because she knew that the key to restoring her life lay in dedication and effort. This humility is often overlooked in modern society, but Ruth reminds us that hard work and dedication are essential to achieve what God has prepared for us. When we put our hands to work with humility and perseverance, God blesses us and leads us to the purpose He has for our lives. Another great lesson from Ruth's life is about hope in times of adversity. When she and Naomi faced the loss of their husbands, life seemed meaningless and the future appeared bleak. However, Ruth never lost hope. She pressed on, trusting that God had something greater in store for her. By doing so, she not only found redemption for herself, but also helped her mother-in-law find hope again. Her faith and trust in God kept her strong, even when everything around her seemed uncertain. In times of crisis, many of us tend to lose hope, but Ruth's life teaches us that we must trust in God, even in the darkest times. The hope she nurtured in her heart was what led her through the struggles and into the blessings waiting for her. Moreover, Ruth exemplifies the power of love and friendship. Her relationship with Naomi was not just that of a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but a deep friendship and mutual commitment. Even when Naomi urged Ruth to go back to her homeland and live her own life, Ruth refused. "Where you go, I will go," Ruth said, demonstrating a love that went beyond family expectations. She wasn't merely fulfilling a duty, she was willing to sacrifice for Naomi without expecting anything in return. In a world where relationships often become superficial, Ruth teaches us that true love, the kind that is willing to sacrifice and support, is the foundation of all meaningful relationships. Her unconditional love for Naomi reminds us that genuine friendship and affection are essential for building a life full of purpose and meaning. Finally, Ruth's life is a clear example of what it means to follow God's will, even when the plans seem uncertain. When she chose to marry Boaz, she wasn't just seeking the security of a relationship, she was following the divine plan God had for her life. By doing so, she became part of the lineage of King David and ultimately the lineage of Jesus Christ. Ruth's decision to obey God, even when the future was unclear, had an eternal impact. Ruth teaches us that when we follow God's will in our lives, we may not understand why certain things happen, but we can be sure that He is working for our good. Her story is living proof that when we obey and follow God's ways, He guides us toward a greater, more beautiful and eternal purpose than we could ever imagine. Ruth was not only a woman who followed God in her own journey, but a woman who left an eternal legacy. Her story teaches us about loyalty, humility, hope, and love. But the impact of her life is far from over. In this video, we will see how the lineage of Ruth and Boaz continues to impact generations, shaping the future of all humanity. Stay tuned to understand how Ruth's story connects with a divine plan greater than anyone could have imagined. Ruth's life, though beginning as a story of loss and struggle, ends with one of the greatest tales of redemption and transformation. Looking back, we can see how her faithfulness, hard work, hope, and unconditional love led her to a future beyond her wildest expectations. The impact of her life was not limited to her generation, but extended through the centuries, culminating in the lineage of David and ultimately the coming of Jesus Christ. Ruth, a woman from Moab, who many would have considered a foreigner, became an essential part of God's plan for humanity. Her story is proof that regardless of where we come from, the challenges we face, or the losses we endure, God can use us to accomplish great things. Ruth's faithfulness and obedience showed that even in the most difficult situations, God can turn pain into unimaginable blessings. By following her mother-in-law Naomi, Ruth not only restored the life of an elderly woman, but also found her own place in God's divine plan. Her journey of humility and courage led her to a place of honor, where she married Boaz and bore a son who would be part of David's line. The simple act of choosing to be faithful, even without knowing what the future would bring, resulted in a legacy that would affect generations. This story reminds us that often the choices we make today not only impact our own lives, but can also shape the future of others in ways we could never imagine. Ruth's life teaches us that when we choose to act with faith, loyalty, and love, we are not only walking a path to our own healing, but also opening doors for others to find their own redemption. Her journey teaches us the importance of trusting God's plans, even when we cannot see the end of the road. Ruth, with her faithfulness, hard work, hope, and unconditional love, leaves us a legacy of strength and wisdom. As we reflect on her life, we can apply these lessons to our own paths. No matter what you're facing today, remember, just like Ruth, you too can be an essential part of the divine plan God has for you and for future generations. So, what do you think about this incredible story of Ruth? Have you ever felt like her, going through tough times, but not losing hope? How can you apply the lessons of faithfulness, humility, and love to your life today? If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about powerful lessons from the Bible, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story that could transform your life. I'd love to hear from you. Which lesson from Ruth touched your heart the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about how we can apply these teachings in our daily lives. And if you want to see more stories like this, turn on notifications to stay up to date with everything we post. Remember, Ruth's life is an example of how faith and obedience can transform our story and the story of those around us. So, keep walking the path of faith and rest assured that great blessings will come into your life too.